What happens when 3 police officers died and a nation divided by guns and politics has nowhere left to hide? The studio lights came up, not in the usual kaleidoscope of a talk show, but in a chilly, austere white. Jimmy Fallon walked out without his trademark smile. The air in the auditorium settled into a hush so deep you could hear the breath of every person waiting. On the giant screen behind him, letters carved themselves into the dark like a brutal incision. Hanover, Pennsylvania. 3 officers down. 2 more wounded. Suspect: Matthew James Ruth, 24. Faces tilted upward, turned to stone. Images passed across the screen. Police cruisers washing red and blue into a wet night. Yellow tape strung across a narrow street. A police cap rolling in a circle until it stopped in a pool of blood. Jimmy didn't open with a joke. He chose direct speech. The case of Matthew James Ruth was not just a crime, he said. It was a warning bell tolling across a fractured America. A long chain of red flags had been raised. No one acted. Then, in under a minute, 3 lives were erased. He lifted his eyes and introduced the evening's guest, Senator Chris Murphy, a man who had spent years fighting for gun safety legislation. The theme sting sounded. The wings parted. Murphy stepped into the light and shook Fallon's hand. The applause that rose wasn't the usual ping of excitement. It was a solemn consensus around grief. When they sat, Fallon asked his first question. When he heard about the case, what was the first emotion Murphy felt? Murphy didn't hesitate. Anger, he said, anger braided with exhaustion. This was not random, not surprising. Ruth's record was a flare that had been lit over and over. Stalking an ex-girlfriend, torching her truck, killing her dog, hovering at windows with a gun in hand. Reports filed, warnings given, cameras rolled, and still nothing. Murphy's conclusion was icily simple. This wasn't merely one man's failure. It was the failure of an entire system. The Tonight Show set, that night, was unlike any taping before it. Instead of glittering lights and a buoyant intro, the room carried the gravity of a courtroom. The ceiling grid poured down a sterile glow. The glossed floor reflected it like glass, bouncing the pale shine back into the tightened faces of the audience. Down in the rows where laughter usually loosened shoulders, people sat rigid. No one dared to break the silence. Tonight wasn't about entertainment. It was about seeing a truth that had been kept out of sight for too long. Cameras panned slowly, catching heavy eyes, knuckles white against knees. When Jimmy sat, he didn't smile. He didn't warm the room with small talk. His shoulders seemed to bear a weight you could see. Beside him, Chris Murphy appeared in a dark gray suit, steady-eyed. He walked with the gravity of a man who had collected 1,000 stories of gun violence and carried every one of them to the chair. They sat opposite, and between them yawned more than a desk. An entire nation split by irreconcilable arguments over guns. The lens tightened on their faces as their eyes met. Fallon, flinty and precise. Murphy, resilient. A veteran of debates where stakes are counted in bodies. The room waited. The air felt thick enough to spark with one stray syllable. Then Fallon spoke. His voice was measured, clear, each word landing like a gavel on hardwood. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight isn't a variety show. Tonight is a conversation the country needs to hear. And the first question is for Senator Chris Murphy. The lights softened, isolating the 2 chairs in a cone of pale focus. Fallon nodded and leaned in. The usual mischief was gone, but the courtesy remained. "Thank you for coming to the Tonight Show," he said, slow and low, matching the gravity that had taken hold. The greeting wasn't perfunctory. It acknowledged that Murphy's presence meant something larger than television. Murphy returned a firm nod. No forced grin, no performance of warmth. Just a spare reply. Glad to be here. But there was fire lit behind his eyes. You could feel that he had come not merely to converse, but to fight with facts, with language. The room dropped another note into silence. A few people traded glances. Everyone understood. This would not be an ordinary night. There would be no easy laughs. Every question and answer would be heavy with the weight of the dead. Fallon tightened his grip on the mic. He didn't rush to the interrogation. The brief pleasantry was a last breath before weather, a necessary pause to steel the room for what was coming. Then his expression hardened. The eyebrows dipped. The courtesies were over. The hearing began. Silence settled again as the camera found Fallon's face. There was no genial glimmer, no playful twitch at the mouth. His chin tipped slightly downward, as if the weight on his shoulders had become the room's. He lifted the mic. One deep breath. A voice steady and unyielding. Words sharp enough to slice the thickness from the air. Senator Murphy, you've spent years of your career fighting for gun control. When you heard about Matthew James Ruth, a 24-year-old who, in 45 seconds, shot and killed 3 police officers and wounded 2 others, what was your first feeling? No frills, no detour. The question was a round fired true. Light fell across Murphy's face. He leaned forward, fingers laced at his knees. His eyes did not flash with sudden rage. They burned with something deeper, refined by time. He paused, letting the silence underscore the answer he was about to give. Fury, he said, 2 syllables packed with burden. He went on, fury because this tragedy was entirely preventable. Fury because a string of warnings was allowed to go unanswered. Ruth stalked his ex-girlfriend. He set fire to her truck. He killed her dog. He loitered outside her home with a rifle. Reports were filed. Neighbors saw. Cameras recorded. And all of it was ignored. You could hear the camera head whisper as it turned. Faces around the room registered shock. Murphy fixed his gaze ahead and pressed on, his voice gathering force. This wasn't an accident. This was the failure of a system, a legal culture that chases aftermath instead of prevention. We had untold chances to intervene before Ruth wrapped his finger around a trigger. Every one was missed. The price? 3 brave officers. Fallon didn't interrupt. The room remained as quiet as a sealed vault, waiting for the next indictment. Murphy's answer hit the floor like a stone block. For a heartbeat, Fallon only looked at him, as if measuring the ground he needed to cross next. The host, who built a career on laughter, became a prosecutor, assigned to pry open a wound his country refused to examine. He raised the mic. The timbre of his voice cooled another degree. Senator, let me be blunt. If Matthew James Ruth hadn't killed police officers, if he had only threatened a woman, or only killed her dog, would we be talking about this at all? Is it true we pay attention only when those who wear the badge fall? A hard truth, dropped without anesthesia. A stir moved through the seats. The camera skimmed clenched jaws, then fell back on Murphy. He did not dodge. His mouth set. His eyes kindled. You're right, he said. That's the problem. When a woman is stalked, when a family loses a dog, when a dangerous man circles a house with a rifle, the response is muted. There are no press conferences. No grand statements from politicians on the other side. But when officers fall, suddenly we hear a chorus about law and order. What about those other lives? Are they worth less? He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable struck like hammer steel. In the audience, a few heads bowed. The question had landed in their laps too. Fallon leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. He took the argument into thornier brush. Supporters of gun rights will say the issue isn't the gun, it's mental health. They'll say Ruth was a troubled man, and that law-abiding owners shouldn't be punished for what a madman does. Senator, your answer? The quiet reset, tighter and hotter. All eyes swung to Murphy. How would he unthread the talking point that had become a shield of habit? The spotlight held his face. He drew a long breath. His hands rested on the chair's arms. Then he bent forward and let the words stand up straight. That argument, he said, is a pretext, one that's been repeated for decades to blur the truth. The room held its breath. Yes, he continued, We need a stronger mental health system. But why do we pretend that one excludes the other? Why does anyone insist we must choose? We can do both: invest in mental health and implement gun safety laws. A handful of people began to clap. The sound fell off when the lens swept over them. Murphy tipped his head, a flash in his eye. And let me add, he said, many of the loudest voices shouting mental health are the same votes that block funding for it. No hospitals, no clinicians, no support. Mental health becomes an excuse to stall any reform that might keep lethal weapons out of dangerous hands. That isn't policy. It's sophistry. Fallon listened, his jaw tight. On the monitor, Murphy no longer looked like a senator answering questions. He looked like a prosecutor reading charges into the record. We're talking about a man with a visible history of violence, Murphy said, chopping the words clean. A man accused of stalking, break-ins, threats, arson, animal cruelty, terrorizing a neighborhood. All of it in the file. And when officers arrived to face him, he had an AR-15, designed for speed and lethality. 3 officers died because of it. The room seemed to lock in place. A few people covered their mouths. Others shook their heads, stunned. Murphy bent closer, his voice dropping as if he were speaking through the camera to millions of living rooms. Don't tell me this is a mental health issue alone. This is about battlefield weapons in the hands of people we already know are dangerous. Until we admit that, Hanover will not be the last. The echo of that line felt like an alarm bell. Fallon's fingers tightened around the mic. He pushed the conversation forward again toward the heart of culpability. Senator, he said, drilling down, you're saying this goes beyond one individual. So who stands accused? Who bears responsibility for the deaths of 3 officers in Hanover? The question hit like a razor cut. The camera found eyes wide, lungs held. Murphy didn't blink. I accuse, he answered. A political system that sold its citizens out. Lawmakers who understand the problem and refuse to act because they fear losing the backing of the gun lobby. And I accuse anyone who keeps telling Americans that owning an instrument of mass death is freedom, when in truth, it's a death sentence for their own communities. The room shuddered. His eyes were lit like a wire. His voice did not tremble. It rang with the pitch of judgment. Look at Hanover, he continued, the cadence quickening. Ruth is not an outlier. He's the newest link in a long chain. Children in their classroom at Sandy Hook, young people in a nightclub in Orlando, shoppers at a supermarket in Buffalo, and now 3 officers in Hanover. How many lists will we read before those in power accept their share of responsibility? Applause cracked, then swelled. There were tears in the lights. Fallon let the sound run. The indictment needed its echo. Murphy lowered his tone, firm as a closing brief. I accuse the men in fine offices in Washington who know red flag laws save lives and still vote no. I accuse those who treat human life as numbers in a power game. And I accuse a political culture that has made silence its easiest option. The applause returned, louder. The sound of a room that had been waiting to say yes. Fallon set the mic down, eyes hard. The conversation had already pushed past the boundary of entertainment. It had become a public hearing, where words became exhibits and silence became guilt. But the counter-argument would come, and Fallon took it there. Senator Murphy, he said, blade sharp, there are people who will say you're exploiting this tragedy to advance your politics, that you're turning 3 funerals into leverage. What do you say to that? It was the hinge. A direct challenge. Some in the audience stared wide. Others shook their heads. This was no longer a safe climb. It was the cliff's edge. Murphy didn't flinch. He leaned in, eyes bright. I wish I weren't here to talk about this, he said. I wish we were talking about music or comedy, anything but these deaths. But we don't have that luxury. When an AR-15 can kill 3 officers in under a minute, silence is the exploitation. Silence turns deaths into nothing. You could hear a pin fall. His cheeks were taut. His voice tolled like a bell. This is not an agenda. This is human life. If speaking for it means I'm labeled political, fine, because silence is complicity, and I will not be complicit. Into this side. The applause now was a wave. People were on their feet, some shouting, "Yes!" Tears shone. Fallon's grip tightened. He did not offer balm or a joke. He nodded slowly, acknowledging a line crossed. The conversation had become a reckoning. Then he drove at the philosophical crux. "What about freedom?" he asked. Words drilling. Gun owners believe their rights are foundational. They think that restricting gun ownership erases the freedom of law-abiding citizens. Can you look them in the eye and say, "Your freedom is worth less than someone else's safety"? The spark hit powder. The room fractured. One half in a taut quiet, the other murmuring. Murphy held his posture. His palm struck his thigh, once measured, firm. "Don't confuse the terms," he said, voice ringing. "Freedom is not the right to make others die. When an assault rifle can turn a school into a cemetery and a market into a battlefield, we're not talking about liberty, we're talking about chaos." He let his gaze move across the seats, taking back the room. We don't let people drive without a license or a health check. We don't let anyone stockpile explosives at home and call it freedom. So why do we allow a violent man to own a weapon built to shred human bodies and call it a constitutional right? Freedom is not a shield for irresponsibility. A roar of hands, some fists lifted, but there were faces etched with resistance too. Fallon stayed with the pressure. "So you believe," he asked, "that freedom and safety cannot coexist?" Murphy's reply was a blade. "We can have both. But there is no true freedom in a country where daily life is soaked in fear of gunfire. A field of graves is not a free society. It's a cemetery." The sentence tore the quiet. Applause stormed the walls. Fallon nodded once. A verdict acknowledged. The showdown had reached its apex. Where there are no escape hatches, only the stark truth, set before a nation. The storm took a long moment to pass. Some people stood and clapped until their hands stung. Others sank in their seats, eyes lowered, pulled into a reckoning they had avoided. Fallon did nothing to diffuse it. He didn't crack a smile. He didn't float a lifeline of levity. He understood that any laugh now would betray the dead. Murphy drew back in the chair. The intensity in his face softened, if only by a shade. For an instant he looked less like a politician at a microphone and more like a person unburdened after too many funerals. He scanned the rows and stopped on a few damp faces, witnesses to the truth rather than consumers of it. From a corner seat, a middle-aged man shouted, "That's right, enough!" Applause detonated again, faster, harder, like drumfire. Still, somewhere in the noise, a thin thread of dissent. "Don't touch the Second Amendment." A reminder that a single sentence could split a country down the middle. Fallon lowered his head, then raised it. Steel lit his eyes. He knew the repercussions wouldn't stay inside the room. In minutes, the exchange would be clipped and shared. By morning, millions would have watched. Millions would have chosen sides. Across Washington, staffers would be counting how these words measured against poll numbers and donor lists. A soft chime signaled the commercial break. No one stood. They sat, eyes locked on the stage, afraid that breathing too loudly would break whatever spell had brought the truth this close. When the show resumed, the air was still viscous with what had been said. Fallon stared at the desk grain as if the wood itself held an answer. Then he lifted the mic and spoke not as an MC but as a voice for the room. "Tonight, we don't laugh," he said. "Tonight, we don't entertain. Tonight, we face a brutal fact. A young man with a long record of violence still owned an AR-15, and 3 officers paid for that with their lives." He turned his eyes to the crowd. Senator Murphy made it plain. This isn't only the fault of one person. It's the fault of a system that knows danger and chooses silence. A system that treats guns as absolute liberty and human life as collateral. He paused, letting the words seat themselves. And the question for all of us is, how many more lives before we act? A ripple moved through the room, nods, tears. The camera stitched those faces together, making a mosaic of conscience. We can disagree on policy, Fallon added, voice weighted, and we can argue about solutions. But one thing we cannot do ever is be silent, because silence is complicity. Applause began as a tremor and grew into a pounding rhythm. Fallon didn't smile. He nodded once in acknowledgement, as if to say, "We've all heard it now." The lights dimmed for the close, but the voice carried. Tonight, The Tonight Show isn't just a program. Tonight, it's a mirror. And the country in that reflection is balanced on the edge between freedom and survival. Is one of the big. The stage fell another shade. Two white beams held Fallon and Murphy like pins. No one moved. Jimmy set the mic down and turned to Murphy. They didn't speak. Their eyes met, and the room felt the silent agreement. This conversation would not end here. It would spill into hallways of power and onto sidewalks and dinner tables. The screen behind them shifted Hanover again. Cruisers, tape, bouquets. A piano line walked slowly through the quiet, each note knocking against a wound still open. The camera found the portraits of 3 fallen officers. Candles flickered next to the frames. People bowed their heads. Others clasped hands. No one left. They sat like witnesses in a memorial. Jimmy stood and shook Murphy's hand. The applause that came was heavy, laced with the sound of people swallowing tears. The camera caught that handshake, which wasn't a TV courtesy. It was a vow that speech must become action. Murphy's gaze looked almost incandescent in the white light. Fallon's grip said what the moment had said all night. The burden had been named. Now, someone had to carry it. Music climbed. Images passed like blades. An AR-15 tagged in an evidence bag. The wrecked faces of widows. A child's eyes widened with fear. Each lingered only a second, but left a cut. When the music ended, the screen went black. One line appeared, white on the void. 3 officers are dead. How many more must die before America changes? The room held still. Fallon bowed and walked into the dim. Murphy followed, straight-backed, disappearing through the wings. The final theme rose without joy. It chimed like a far bell at a funeral, closing a night where a talk show had turned into a public court, where words entered the record and silence entered the docket as a crime. When the house lights finally died, the audience stood and filed out, no chatter, no quips. Footsteps rang slow, grief heavy. Faces were marked. Eyes were red. Outside, New York was the opposite of quiet. Clips of the exchange spread like sparks. Murphy's charge against the system, Fallon's question about freedom, the line that cracked the air, "A country of graves is not a free society." Praise poured from advocates of reform. At last, a show brave enough to turn a spotlight into a hearing. Tweets burned with candle emojis and the faces of the 3 officers. Families of victims posted thank yous for a platform loud enough to carry their dead. The backlash arrived just as fast. Gun rights groups blasted the segment, "Fallon and Murphy politicized police deaths." This wasn't a show. It was propaganda. Conservative outlets aired counter-programming, accusing the broadcast of exploiting tragedy. By morning, headlines slabbed the country. Jimmy Fallon strips away the jokes, turns The Tonight Show into a public tribunal. Chris Murphy versus America. Freedom or survival. 3 officers down. 1 nation split. On Capitol Hill, interns replayed the clip in hallways. Some Democrats nodded, chalking it up as momentum. Many Republicans bristled, calling it performance, not policy. In cafes and subways and family rooms, arguments broke open. For some, that night was a turning point. The country couldn't keep going like this. For others, it was a threat. "They will never take my gun." The show's echo did not end with applause. It cut the national map into opposing fields, and forced people to choose where they stood. But whatever the stance, one fact refused to fade. The Hanover dead had become a new emblem, and the question remained, repeating itself all day in 100 million heads. How many more must die before change? The screen inside the mind went dark, leaving only a small, bright point like a candle in wind. Jimmy's voice returned, not the hosts, but the citizens, the witnesses, the man who would not let the hard sentence go unsaid. 3 officers in Hanover are dead. They were not the first. If we keep silent, they won't be the last. The piano rose again. On the inner screen, the reel unwound. A classroom at Sandy Hook, a club in Orlando, a market in Buffalo, and then Hanover. Each image was brief, but seared deep. Jimmy looked straight into the lens, the kind of gaze that finds you through glass. We can argue about how, he said, but we cannot argue about this. Guns have taken too many lives. Our silence day after day is a form of consent. He lowered his voice. The question is no longer who is next. The question is, what do we do to ensure that there is no next? Numbers flashed. 45,000 dead by gun in a year. The digits pulsed, then stopped crimson, clotted. Murphy leaned in, voice steady, joining the call. We can't let their deaths dissolve. Red flag laws, reasonable limits, real funding for mental health. The tools exist, but they will stay on paper if the public stays quiet. If you're listening, demand action. Applause rose like a single heartbeat. The lens found a woman wiping tears, a veteran offering a crisp salute, a teenager with fists clenched for a future he wanted to live. Fallon nodded. His voice framed the last line. Tonight, the Tonight Show ends. The conversation doesn't. Speak, act, turn outrage into change. Every day we wait is another siren in the dark, and another name carved into stone. The screen went black. One sentence stood alone. Silence is complicity. Action is the only choice. The music stopped. The night closed not in laughter, but in a summons that would echo long after the stage went dark. And that, perhaps, is only the beginning. There are more truths to be aired, more conversations to be had, more shadows to be lit. You shouldn't miss them. Like to spread the message, share so others can hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next urgent chapter.